My name is David Wagner, and I'm a long-term resident of Japan. Recently, I had the honor and the pleasure of meeting Professor Donald Keene. And in addition to that, I have an old friend who is from the University of Colorado, Dr. Joyce Lebra, who specialized in Japanese history. Joyce was here in Japan in December 2012 to celebrate her 88th birthday, in Japanese called Beiju. And it was an opportune time for Dr. Lebra and Dr. Keene to come together and talk about their post-war experiences. So in the next 40 minutes, you'll be able to observe very interesting commentary from the two of them, not only on how they developed their interest in Japan, but also how they felt about some pivotal events, including the death of Mishima Yukio, as well as where Japanese studies are going in the future and what their wishes are for people who are interested in Japanese history and literature. So please enjoy the interview, and let's take a look. Professor Lebra, Professor Keene, thank you so much for coming, and it's a great honor to be with you today.
Pleasure.
Two icons of Japanese-American post-war history in front of us here. You've both really had incredible lives and experienced many things in the past 50 years since you started coming to Japan. And in many ways, you have become symbolic of a generation of Japan scholars that taught during a time when Japan was experiencing unprecedented interest. Would you share with us some of your thoughts of the highlights of your many decades here? And we'll start ladies first with Professor Lebra.
Well, I came first in 1955 on a Fulbright grant, and I was able to stay 2 years at that time. And this was really shortly after the end of the war. There was still black markets around in the alleys, and we'd see soldiers, veterans, with their limbs missing and on crutches at almost all the train stations, and sometimes they'd be sleeping in boxes at night in the winter. And my first 3 years in Japan, I stayed with families, and there were very few facilities. There was a hole in the ground for the toilet, and there was no plumbing. And this is an upper middle class family, a professor at Todai. And then, teaching Japanese history was sort of in its early stage. I was sort of the tail end of the first generation of Japan scholars, and there were very few of us at that time. So, and I was able to teach Japanese history in any way I chose. I probably taught 25 different courses on Japanese history. For example, Japanese history through cinema was a course I introduced at Colorado. But when you say unprecedented interest, at the University of Colorado, this was not so. There was far more emphasis on Chinese language, for example, even though there were waiting lists of students wanting to take Japanese, but for political reasons at the University of Colorado, the Chinese side had more emphasis. And I was always lobbying the administration to have more courses on not only Japan, but the rest of Asia. For example, in Asian religion, there was nobody teaching at the time. So okay. I was always lobbying to get more focus on Asia, but particularly Japan.
And probably, Professor Keene, getting a focus on Asia was not difficult at Columbia. Maybe you could talk about how it all sort of began for you.
In my career, my whole interest in Japan and Asia in general came from a complete accident. I was, as a freshman at Columbia, I was seated in a class next to a Chinese. I had never before spoken to a Chinese. I didn't know anything about it, but seeing this Chinese 4 days a week from 9 to 10, we became friends. And we had Chinese lunch every day at the New Asia restaurant on Broadway, egg foo young and fried rice every day. That was the cheapest thing on the menu. And then I asked him to teach me some Chinese characters. He did, but he didn't give me any pronunciations because he didn't speak the proper Northern Chinese language, and he didn't want to teach me Cantonese. And so I learned characters and their English meanings, but not what they sounded like in Chinese. And we did this for about a year before I started to take classes at Columbia, which were on a very, very slow level, 3 times a week, and old-fashioned texts about good little boys who are good with their parents and always look after them, things of that sort. And then the war broke out. We learned of the war breaking out in the Chinese restaurant. President Roosevelt's address was hearable in the restaurant. And about that time, I heard of the Navy Japanese language school, which was at first in Berkeley, California, and then the Army ordered the Navy to remove its school from the West Coast. The Army had control over the West Coast because our teachers were a danger to national security. Well, it was absurd.
Yes.
But that's what happened. I'm so surprised about what Joyce said about Colorado, because we moved to the University of Colorado, and there a whole generation of people learned Japanese. We were, my class was the second. The first one was a very special small one. People who already knew Japanese fairly well. The second were chosen from major universities and from a small number of missionary children's. And we went through the course in 11 months because they said we were desperately needed. Later on, it was extended to 14 months and later to 18 months, I believe.
But, Professor...
This is before I began teaching there, which, I mean, the Navy language school had already ended. And my first classes in Japanese were taught at the tail end of the Army Specialized Training Program at the University of Minnesota. And my teacher was a very exotic Eurasian woman whose main business was tobacco. She was selling tobacco, American tobacco, to the Japanese tobacco monopoly. And I'm sure she was much better at that than at teaching Japanese. She told me it was so easy for her to make money in that field.
But you started, your roots of all of this started in Honolulu.
Yes, because I think I can trace my interest in Japan back to my childhood there, because when I was a child in the 30s, in Honolulu, the Japanese were the largest ethnic group. They were much larger than any other ethnic group. And so, there was Japanese culture all around me, and I can remember playing with little kids in the neighborhood, and I was so proud I could count to 10 and count to 100 in Japanese. I went around counting to 100 in Japanese.
And so, but yours started in New York.
It started in New York.
In a Chinese restaurant.
And at the time, I was not interested in China or Japan. I thought that culture began with the Greeks, and that was the education I had in the great books, beginning with Homer and the other great Greek dramatists and so on. It never occurred to me that there were major cultures elsewhere. I asked my Chinese friend on one occasion to recommend a book, Chinese book, that had been translated into English, and he said the Analects of Confucius would be a good one to start with. I found the Analects of Confucius extremely boring and elementary, having read Plato and Aristotle. This was just household comments on how to be a good citizen and so on.
Yeah, moral maxims.
So I was not at all impressed with Chinese culture. But then in 1940, I had the great experience of, by accident, buying a copy of Arthur Waley's translation of The Tale of Genji. I bought it because it was so cheap. It was a large edition which hadn't sold out, and they were selling off the remainders. 2 volumes for something like 49 cents. And I bought it not because I wanted to learn about the tale of Genji, which I'd never heard of before, because it represented a large number of pages for a small amount of money.
Value for money.
And that changed my whole view. I became deeply interested in Japan.
And that was as the war was breaking out.
It was in 1940. And 1940 was a terrible year. It was the year that the Germans overran Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Holland, France. And every day there was something terrible in the newspaper. And my escape from the newspapers was the tale of Genji.
Interesting. And then during the war, where were you, Professor Lebra, in all of
At
this?
the University of Minnesota.
And you, interestingly, were the first woman in the United States to receive a PhD
Yeah.
in Japanese history.
I was also the only woman in the history department for 15 years.
So you're a trailblazer. Let's talk a little bit, if we can, about some of your specific experiences. And Professor Lebra, I'd like to talk about the Mishima Yukio incident in 1970. You were the only non-Japanese present in the Ichigaya barracks on
I
that
went there
day.
every Wednesday. I was doing military history, and so I was given access to the War History Library, which wasn't true of every Japanese who wanted to get in there, by the way. But they probably thought, well, this is an American woman. She's probably harmless. So I was doing military history, World War II, and I went there every Wednesday. This happened on a Wednesday, November 25th, 1970. And I was sitting in the library around noontime, and suddenly all these helicopters were circling overhead, and there was a lot of noise, and I tried to concentrate, but finally I decided I better go out and see what's happening. So I went out into the courtyard in front of the administration building, and one of the officers had a megaphone. He said, all the soldiers, please gather around in the front, and I went out and stood with them, and everybody was wondering what's happening. And then I heard somebody mention Mishima's name, and then before long, he stepped out on the front of the balcony with a couple of his Tatenokai members, and he was dressed, of course, in this Meiji-style uniform and had a hachimaki around his forehead. And these two soldiers of his army hung a big banner out in front of the balcony, and then he started his harangue, which went on for 7 minutes. He was looking at his watch. He was very conscious of the timing and everything surrounding this event. His last act, this was his stage. And he started talking, and why Japan needs a real army, and we have to have a new constitution. This is not a real army, and he went on for exactly 7 minutes, looking at his watch. And then, actually, the soldiers were, as well as I were incredulous that here were these words from the 1930s, these military-sounding words from the 1930s, and I said to myself, well, this is a historic event. I mean, I didn't know what was going to happen next, but even so, it was as if somebody went into the Pentagon and held the place hostage and got on a stump and made a speech. And at the end, there were soldiers saying, oh, baka, or go take a cold shower and things like that. And then finally, at the end of the 7 minutes, he goes, Tenno Heika Banzai. And not very many voices answered him. But then I went back in the library, and then, a few minutes later, we heard what had happened, and there were police cars then, and police cars took away 3 of the soldiers of the army, and with the 3, and we learned that he had committed seppuku. And the thing is that I've been in that office of the commanding general in the headquarters building, and it's possible to barricade it, which is what these young soldiers had done, and they tied up General Mashita in his chair, so he had to watch the whole thing in horror, but he was helpless, and nobody could get into the office. But after that, for days, and were you here then?
No, I was in New York.
For days and weeks after that, nobody was talking about anything else. All the magazines, newspapers, journals put out special issues. And actually, that day I was kind of afraid to leave the compound because I knew it would be surrounded by really right-wing militants. And finally, I did leave, and I couldn't. I was very upset. You know, I came back to I-House, and I went in the library and got out his book, Sun and Steel. I couldn't sleep that night, so I was reading Sun and Steel. You know, his ideas. Death. The word death appears on every page, and I still couldn't sleep after I finished the book. So I got up and wrote down my impressions of the day's event, and
I think you took those impressions and you
then my friend Perpetua, who is here at this moment, said, well, she came by my room the next day here at I-House. She says, I said, you know, Perpetua, I was there yesterday. She says, and I said I couldn't sleep, so I wrote this down. And she looked at it and she said, well, but we have to go and sell this we have to go to the newspapers with this. So the New York Times bought it, so that was my first entry into journalism. And I guess the Yomiuri or the Mainichi also published it. And a week later, I wrote another kind of more reflective article. And then I was on my way to Australia at the time, and when I got to Australia, my notoriety as the only foreigner to hear Mishima had preceded me, and so everybody was asking me to talk about Mishima as if I was some kind of expert or authority on Mishima, which I know you are, Donald. Anyway, so a bit later when I went to Texas, I had a first teaching job at Texas replacing Bill Braisted, who was here in Japan at the time, and I wrote a longer article in a little journal called Literature East and West, which was published by the University of Texas. But the event, well, as Donald knows, was extremely well scripted, and this was his final act, and there were all kinds of personal and cultural elements that fed into this. I mean, not only his exhibitionism and his narcissism and so on, but his feeling that he wanted to get back, he wanted to embody a samurai. He wanted to do the Bushido thing. And he started to feel, I'm sure Donald can elaborate on this, he started to feel that intellectuals didn't really have it. They didn't know how to act. So he wanted to unite art and action. And he also had this, as he says in several places, he had this feeling of the end of life. He always had. And as someone commented, I don't know whether his mother or his sister or his wife said, well, he was always looking for a place to die, just like Saigo Takamori or Yoshida Shoin.
Any insights, Professor Keene, on that? I think you had some contact with him.
Well, I was a close friend of his for about 17 or 18 years. And that summer, the summer he died, he invited me to Shimoda, where he spent the month of August with his children. Normally, he didn't see his children at all because he did his writing from midnight until 2 or 3 in the morning, and then he would sleep until 2 in the afternoon, and then he'd go off to kendo lessons, and in the evening he would be with other writers. And so he would see his children very seldom. They would be at school, or else he couldn't see them for other reasons, but he devoted that month to them. And when we first became friends, he had said to me, I don't like sticky relations. And I interpreted that as meaning not to tell him my griefs or my hopes or things like that. We would have good conversations about other subjects.
Was this in English? When did this word
this was in Japanese. We always spoke Japanese
sticky,
together.
what's the Japanese sticky?
And in Shimoda, we were sitting together near the pool. He was he wanted to show off his physique. He was in a bathing suit, but he did not go in the water. And I suddenly said to him, if there's something worrying you, tell me. This is breaking my promise of 17 years. I sensed something, but I didn't know what it was. He didn't answer me. He turned his eyes away. But his conduct was very strange. He and an English newspaperman, Henry Scott Stokes, the three of us went to a restaurant where they had lobster out of season. And he first ordered 5 for the three of us. And then, having seen the 5, he ordered 2 more so that we'd have a fill of lobster. It was a strange performance, but he knew this was the last time he would see us.
Interestingly, for both of you, was his act, which seemed to be a rejection of the direction Japan was going, was that a futile act, or do you think it had significance in terms of the direction of Japan afterwards?
I don't think he had a clear political vision, really. I don't think it was a political act. I think it was an artistic and symbolic act. And one of my friends, I talked to various friends about it, and one of my friends said, it was a manly way to die. They don't do it that way anywhere else in the world, do they? And then in Australia, and where I was staying in University House, there were entryways for 6 apartments. And one day, instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 3.5, 5, 6. So then I knew some important Japanese was on the way, and it turned out to be Prince Mikasa's son. And so I asked him what he thought about Mishima. Oh, he had the courage of his convictions, or his motives were very pure.
And you agree it was an artistic act more than...
Yes, I do. When I left Japan in September for New York, he came to see me off. This was very strange because I knew that he hadn't slept the preceding night. His eyes were bloodshot, he was unshaven, and I was very, very surprised. After my plane left, my other friends and he had a meal in the restaurant at the airport, and he suddenly said, I don't believe in dying a stupid death. Mm-hmm. And at 10 o'clock in the morning, this was not what people expected, but I believe he had decided aesthetically that he was getting weaker, older. Yeah. He had already published 36 or 38 volumes of every kind of plays and novels and criticism, and he was defeated in his hopes of getting the Nobel Prize, which was something he wanted very badly, and he thought it would be another 20 years after Kawabata, and he didn't want to wait that long.
He thought older people are ugly. He didn't want a sagging body. He liked the idea of a young, heroic death.
It seems that he received that.
Yes.
Can we move on to another topic? I'm curious about the development of both of your careers and your respective interests. Dr. Keene, you focused on literature throughout your career, and you're still actively teaching from what I understand. Yes. Could you talk about how Japanese studies have changed from the early post-war era to now? We seem to see more interest in places like China. Is that your feeling?
No, it's not really. There's been a great deal of interest in China as an export market or import market, but at Columbia University, there has been no decline in the interest in Japanese literature. There has been an increase in Chinese literature, but that is because there was less interest in Chinese literature before, and now it's coming up to the level of Japanese. I talked to someone at UCLA, where they have a strong department of Japanese studies, and he said the same thing. There are more people for Japanese literature. I think people are likely to turn to Chinese studies if they're interested in economics, other subjects which involve trade and so on. But in literature, I think the Japanese literature exerts more attraction than Chinese literature.
And the reason for that is?
Well, it starts off with a bang. It starts off with the Manyoshu, which is a great collection. And then it has the Tale of Genji, there is nothing like it in Chinese literature. And then, skipping a lot, you have the haiku, which has a great popularity, not among people who are scholars of Japanese, but people who write haiku in English and are interested in learning more about Japan. And I think that Japanese modern literature has been widely read by people. There are re-editions of the translations of, let's say, Mishima or Natsume Soseki. They're still of interest.
Well, the same thing is true at the University of Colorado, that the Japanese language and literature has expanded to the PhD level. However, in answer to your question, Chinese is being taught all over in the public schools, down to the primary school level. So in the general population, there's a lot more interest in China, which will grow as, I presume, China becomes a greater power.
How about in the area of history, Japanese history?
Well, the big difference is that, in my generation, this is the first generation, there were only a handful of us. And I was at the tail end of the first generation. We were all talking about the Meiji Restoration. We were all studying the Meiji Restoration and the various figures like Kido and Okuma and Yamagata and so on. And now there's a tremendous number of specialists in Japanese history. And so it has diversified into, intellectual history, religious history, urban history. Gender studies is becoming very big, and as well as political. Also, Japan's relationship with Korea and China has become a big focus, the Japanese colonial experience. So there's no comparison in terms of numbers of scholars of Japanese history.
Interesting. And just to continue with the theme, you're also quite unusual in the sense that you not only specialize in Japanese history, but also Indian history. How did that interest come about?
Because at Harvard, Professor Reichar was my advisor, but he didn't teach history. He taught first-year Japanese. And actually, the language preparation at Harvard was very inadequate at the time compared with Columbia and Michigan, and probably Yale as well. But I did more work with Professor Ingalls, Daniel Ingalls, who was a modern India person. I did several readings courses with him and became very interested in India. On the other hand, the person who was teaching, my China field was ancient China, which didn't really grab me. And so India became my second field, which is a very unusual combination. And it's also because hardly anybody else does that. But it was also interesting to me that I was focused on these two cultures, which are so far apart. They're like 180 degrees apart in many ways in terms of aesthetics or even personal relations, the way people relate. I mean, Indians love to argue and to debate. And if you make a statement, very commonly your Indian friend will say, "No, but." How many times have you heard a Japanese start a conversation with "no"? And Japanese aesthetics is so shibui. I mean, except for maybe the costumes of No and Kabuki, but Indian aesthetics is the opposite. It's flamboyant. Indians love to talk with their hands and argue, and it's just totally different.
Completely different.
What? But it may be two sides of my own personality. I don't know.
Interesting. But Professor Keene, of course, you stayed strictly with Japan in terms of your focus over these 50 years. Could you talk a little bit about how your love of Japanese literature grew over time?
Well, when I started Japanese literature, there was one predecessor, Arthur Waley, who had made the translation not only of the Tale of Genji, but of the No Place and part of the Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon, the great classics. He had shifted to Chinese literature at some point and did little in Japanese literature after that. But he was still my model. I thought I was going to do Chinese and Japanese and be a second Arthur Waley. But while I was studying Chinese as a graduate student at Columbia, under a great Dutch professor, Duivendak, he called me one day and said, "Why do you look so sad all the time?" And I told him the reason was I could read Japanese easily, and to read classical Chinese word after word was exasperating. And I was not getting any pleasure from it. And he said, "Then why don't you read Japanese? We need Japanese specialists." And I felt released. I didn't have to do Chinese anymore. But one time, I thought of another thing. My first teaching was in England, in Cambridge, and I had so few students. I thought I must teach something with more students, and I tried to learn Russian. I had no luck with it at all. I could learn the grammar, which wasn't too difficult, but I couldn't remember the words, the vocabulary, and I think it was because I was accustomed to leaning on the kanji, and there were no kanji involved in Russian, and so it was difficult for me to remember Russian language, and I finally gave up on that.
Interesting. And you both published widely, in your respective fields.
Yes.
And Joyce, you recently published a book called...
Well, I want to tell you why I went into Indian history. In recent years, I haven't done anything in Japanese history. It's all been India. But I had these two fields, Japan and India, and I wanted to do some research that would combine them. And I'm not a Buddhologist or a person in ancient history, so what I found was the Indian National Army, which fought for Indian independence with Japanese military help. And so that was my first venture into joint Japanese and Indian history. And I had another Fulbright grant, and I spent that year in India, during which I nearly died. I had every kind of illness known to India. I thought, if I ever get out of here alive, I'm never coming back. But I've been back about 8 times. But and then from working on the Indian National Army, I learned that there was a women's regiment in it called the Rani of Jhansi Regiment. So then I had to find out, who was this Rani of Jhansi anyway? And it turns out that she was the Indian Joan of Arc. She was killed in battle by the British in 1858. So she got hold of me. I couldn't do anything else for a few years except find out about the Rani of Jhansi. And so I did write a novel about her. Well, first of all, I wanted to write a history of the Rani of Jhansi, but I found out that all the written sources were in English in the India Office Library and in the National Archives in Delhi. How do you write about an Indian Joan of Arc with nothing but British sources? So I decided I'll have to fictionalize her, in which I did. But then I went back and Indian sources are in large part oral and traditional and folk songs, and so I went back to India with my camera and recorder and did this book, The Rani of Jhansi, a study in female heroism in India. And then the subsequent was I was given a fellowship 4 years ago in Singapore, the Institute, over 80 already, the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, and to write a book about the Rani of Jhansi Regiment, which came out as under the title Women Against the Raj, the Rani of Jhansi Regiment.
Is that your favorite book if you look at all the books you've published? If you were to say which is your favorite single book?
Oh, maybe my novel, The Scent of Sake. Have you seen it?
I haven't seen it, no. I've read other books of yours, though.
It's actually, there was a prototype, a woman who did build the largest sake empire in Japan 100 years ago in the Kobe area. And I was stonewalled when I tried to find out about her from her descendants. What does your father say about her, or your grandfather? Nothing. Nothing. But she built the biggest sake empire in Japan. And so all that did was make me more determined to find out more about her.
And Professor Keene, if you were to, it's an unfair question again, but which is your favorite translation of all of the work that you've done?
My favorite translation is the one I call Essays in Idleness, Tsurezorigusa in Japanese, written by a Buddhist priest in the 14th century. I wrote it while I was living in Karuizawa during the rainy season when nobody's there. And somebody brought me food every day. I just sat there and I wrote until I became the author, Kenko. And I was writing as if it were my own book. And this was necessary in a sense because although what he writes is extremely interesting and brilliant in places, he uses the same words over and over again. In English, that doesn't go. And I had to come up with a different English word each time to make it sound correct in English, not simply a translation. And I think it succeeded. That was my favorite of my books because of that reason. I felt as if I was partly the author, although there's nothing in it which is not in the original.
Fascinating. Tell me what your next plans are what's your next project you're working on?
I think, like Okuma, I've said everything I had to say, but I've been just doing a little, not a memoir, but like a journal of my research in other countries. It's called An Asian Attachment.
That's a work in progress.
Well, I basically have done a draft of it. I mean, I don't think anybody wants to publish it, but I also did an ebook novel recently about Hawaii called Keene Fires, which is the theme is the murder of Hawaiians over land issues, which had happened. And as soon as I heard somebody say, "Well, I'm from Hawaii, but I can never go back," why not? Because my father and my uncles were all killed trying to get our land back. As soon as I heard that, I knew I had to write this.
Professor Keene, what are you working on now?
I'm working now on a book on the 20th century poet Ishikawa Takuboku. I find him the first modern Japanese. There are people from quite a long time back who became interested in the West, absorbed the West, were interested in not only in literature but in Western science, Western politics, and so on. But when one reads his diary, one suddenly is in the presence of somebody you might know today. It's extraordinary work. It's not like anything else I know. When I compiled my anthology of Japanese literature, that was in 1955. This book was probably of great importance, if I may say so myself, more than any other book I've ever written, because it made it possible to teach in colleges where there was no specialist in Japanese literature, read a selection of Japanese literature. And it has remained in print for over 50 years, it's 60 years, and still sells. Among the writers in this, the 2 volumes of this book, are among the most famous writers of Japanese history, for going back to the Manyoshu of the 8th century. But the work that's had the most impact on students is the diary written by Takuboku in the 1910s, because it is so close to themselves. And I think I've skirted around him for a long time. I think now I want to write a whole book about him.
Very ambitious. To students studying Japanese literature, Japanese history now, what are your final thoughts and hopes for them for the future?
I hope that Japanese literature will become part of the education of everyone who's interested in literature. I don't mean by that they must follow the latest French dissection of literature or anything of that sort. That technicality does not interest me, and it won't interest people 10 years from now. But the real nature of Japanese literature is special. It's a contribution to the literature of the world, and it deserves to be read. One cannot assume that literature was something invented by the Greeks and spread throughout Europe afterwards. That is the education I received, and my predecessors received it, and all the people who studied Latin and Greek, thinking that this was the core of all of education, were mistaken. That is a part of education, and to be a really educated person, one must know something at least about the rest of the world, whether it is Japan or China or India or Persia. The world is full of marvelous literature.
Fantastic. Any thoughts on the same front there?
Well, I've always sounded rather messianic at the university, saying that Asia is 2/3 of the world. You know, I've always had to. When I was there teaching initially, it was mostly American. It was all American history and European history. And in fact, Colorado has a big center of the American West, which has a big place in education in Colorado. But I think there's still a lot of work for more diversification in the study of Japanese history.
There's already been a change. It used to be that when I talked about the etiquette observed by Japanese in the Heian period, I would tell them about how it was like, and unlike, the court of Louis XIV, who got to go through which doors, whether both doors were open or only one door were open, and that sort of thing. Most recently, the students don't know very much about Louis XIV. They're more likely to know about the Tale of Genji.
Thank you very much for your time today, and wish you both fantastic experiences in the future. It's been wonderful spending time with you.
Thank you.